In this episode, I chat and dive into quite a deep diving and diverse conversation with Dr. Arne Rubinstein from the Rites of Passage Institute, a fellow facilitator and friend, and we dive into the space between, literally the liminal space of not knowing and the space between who we were and who we are to become. We talk about ritual design and how we can design rituals in communities, but also for ourselves, and what makes a ritual in turning profane time into sacred time. We also talk about the importance of community in these rites of passage processes and the fundamental role that rites of passage played in the, I suppose, maintenance of the integrity of communities in traditional cultures and what the lack of that in our culture is leading to. And we talk about integration and the importance of integration and what we might be asking ourselves at this critical time during COVID-19. To note, this was recorded in April 2020 during COVID-19. So whilst some of the topics of conversation are relevant to COVID, they're also deeply relevant to the rest of our lives. The connection was also a little bit shabby, and so I trust that you can sit with the humanness of the tech world. So buckle in, enjoy, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Grab a tea, take a breath, notice the inhale, the exhale, and the space between. A moment in between moments. Here you are. You're listening to Spaces Between with your friend and host, L. Jeffrey. An open exploration into restoring connection in the 21st century in our personal lives, our relations, and our communities. What does it mean to live in relationship to the wholeness of who we are together? I'm not one for ads and am one for creating something beautiful with others, in this case, you. So if you enjoy our time together, I do invite you to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, rate and leave a review for the show. And if you're feeling super generous and fueled and filled up by our conversations, you might even consider donating or soon joining my Patreon membership. Just visit www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com, where you'll also find show notes and other useful links and resources following these conversations. So this is it. Let's dive in. How has your online parenting in the times of crisis work been going, by the way?
Going slowly. I think still people resist personal growth. It's quite extraordinary. Even in this time when we are use the expression, prescribed to go home and be in the personal growth of ourselves and our families and everything like that, there is still a lot of resistance. And there's still a lot of people who are trying to hold on to how it's been. And I consider this whole, that we're in a rite of passage. We're in a transformational time. And part of a transformational time, the first part is separating from our normal everyday lives. And whilst we are doing that, there's still a lot of people, I think, who are fighting that and trying to keep all their work as normal and trying to keep their income the same and all of these things. So that's also very interesting to observe, rather than just sort of submitting and accepting the process, part of which is, we're not going to work anymore, we're not going to the shops for a period of time, and we're going to be home with ourselves and our families and our loved ones, and that's actually what's, coming up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The clinging on to like the ghosts of the past, just that clinging for certainty, which I would love to dive into the call it, the idea of apprenticing yourself to the unknown. That's something that it gets thrown around a lot and is really difficult to hear when you are in the discomfort of the unknown and someone just says, oh, just apprentice yourself to the unknown. What does that mean? So I'd love to get into that. Cool. So I'm going to be taking some notes while we're chatting, just for references and things to share with people afterwards. So if I am looking down, that's what I'm doing. Otherwise, let's just kick into it. Awesome.
We'd already kicked into it.
We had, but I'll do a little thingy. Cool. So
great.
Arne, thank you very much for taking the time and joining me for our conversation.
Very happy to be here, Al. I was actually remembering the first time I met you, which was in a paddock across the valley from where I live, and you and I were both a part of a gathering that was happening there, a festival, and that invited people from all around the country and actually from all around the world. And I remember you arrived in your car, and straight away you were asking a question as to how to get somewhere. And I can't remember exactly where that was, but you wanted to go somewhere. And I remember thinking, this is an interesting young man. This is sort of having this feeling of a seeker, someone who is an explorer, who, had that energy to really look around. And that's been a number of years now, and I've, met you in various different contexts at festivals. I've seen your work. You've come and done my Rites of Passage leadership training. So I'm very happy to be here on this podcast with you, Al.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was reflecting as well, that Uplift gathering with a bunch of other incredible and some weird and wacky folk as well. And then obviously up at Yarakura, where you are now, doing your training, and Rainbow Serpent in workshops a number of times as well. So it's great to have been swimming in similar circles for much of the last at least 6 years, and for our work to be aligned in very similar ways. So I'm excited to explore that. But as a way of, I suppose, building context for the conversation, before we dive into your story a little, where are you now? And just some words from your perspective, where are we now in this significant time?
Okay, so where I am physically is I'm on top of a mountain near Mullumbimby on my property, Yarakura, looking out over the forest. And I'm on 150 acres in lockdown. I have a small community. There's about 6 of us who are on the property at the moment. So that's a very special place to be. So that's where I am physically. Where I am personally is I'm 56 years old, and I feel like I'm on that edge between sort of grown up and elder. And I'm not an elder yet. I just feel like I've got my toes are just starting to move, and I'm just starting to look into that space and explore really what that means and how you fully probably submit to that. And, I knew that I was going to have a transformational year, and it's certainly turning out that way. And then where we are at on sort of the larger scale is, we are right in the middle of this lockdown period of this, precipitated by the coronavirus. But I believe that we are in the middle stage of a rite of passage. We are in the transformational stage where our previous life no longer makes sense. We're not going back to that. We're not going back to working the same way, to associating the same way, to many things like that. But we don't actually know what we're going to yet. So whether we like it or not, we are actually in the uncertainty. And within that, there is huge challenge and enormous opportunity. And the two of them are actually entwined almost as lovers. The challenge and the opportunity are right there in our faces and in our psyches and in our day-to-day. And that's a very interesting place, and especially given that most of the world is here at the same time. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah. And in a way, we are, more disconnected than we were physically, but globally now we have this incredible sense of unity and mutuality and sharing in this massive uncertainty. And yes, the opportunity and also the complete vulnerability of not knowing. The other day I was just reading the etymology of the word sacred, which I can't remember what the Latin word was, but it's basically that which is cursed and that which is blessed.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know if you know the actual Latin word, but I think that really speaks to our time. So I thought before we hear a little bit more about how you got here, so how your journey over the last 30 or so years.
Now you've just blown me away that sacred. And so you've just blown me away that sacred is what is blessed and what is cursed, and how what a beautiful duality that is. We have the opportunity to create a whole new pathway forwards, but in order to do that, we have to lose our old pathway. It's that whole, there's a death happening, but at the same time as the death is happening, that is therefore creating space for the rebirth. And, that's sacred.
Yeah, the kind of natural entropy of ourselves, our cultures, our ecologies, which creates the energy for the next evolution, which might be more complex, or if we're stuck in our way, could be just the same. But before we get into your story, because I'm really curious to hear, I think in all the times we have crossed paths, I don't think I've heard really some of your defining moments or moments of transition that got you to where you are and fueled your work in the world. But I thought I'd read a poem just as a way to kind of frame our conversation, really to do with the spaces between rites of passage, the role of community and development, identity and belonging. But I thought I'd read this poem and then get your feelings on the poem or your thoughts and then lead into your story. So the poem is called 17. It is, I am mired in transition, a sense of in-betweenness, childhood and adulthood, tradition and assimilation. I mourn the loss of certainty, shifting like tectonic plates. My identity searches for stable ground. I look between the gaps in my bookcase, the cracked concrete in my driveway, the dashed lines in the road on the way to school. I find nothing. So I'm just curious what that, first of all, speaks to you, but then I'm also curious about those moments of kind of nothingness in your life that led you to rites of passage and the work you do.
Yeah, well, interesting that 17 is in the sort of the title of the poem, because that was when I actually finished school, which was very much traditional school in a traditional way, and everything was very laid out for me. And then I went overseas for a year, and I was at an all-boys school. And then I went overseas and I had a year of freedom and adventure and passion and challenge and being me, actually being me for the first time ever. And in the uncertainty of that year away, I found the greatest joy and self-knowing that I had ever discovered. So I think that was actually a pivotal moment for me, and really sort of, on a sort of a deeper level within my psyche, showed me that in order to grow, we really need to leave what is known and spend a period of time in the unknown in order to come back in a different way. Having said that, when I came back from my year away at 18, no one was really interested in what had happened to me while I was away. Everybody wanted me to be the old Arne. I remember walking into the house and Mum going, "Hi, Arne, put your washing in the laundry and dinner's in half an hour." And going to myself, no, I've just been away for a year. I've been an adult looking after myself in all sorts of situations. So it also showed me that this transition that we go through and the rites of passage that happen in our lives actually have to continue beyond the event into a new way of being, and that actually has to be managed. And I'd really like to, I will make sure I talk about that in this discussion with you, because it is so important to what's happening now. But I went on from that time. I went to university and I studied medicine and I became a doctor. And I spent time as a general practitioner, and then I moved into emergency medicine. And one of the really big things for me in emergency medicine was seeing how many teenagers were in the emergency department. I called it the overrepresentation of teenagers. And I came to this realisation that many of the reasons they were there were actually completely unnecessary, in that they were self-created in an attempt to do something that would make them feel like an adult, a man, a woman, an adult. And they were putting themselves at risk physically, emotionally, in all sorts of different ways to try and grow up. And that was sort of one of the first clues to me that there was something missing, and we weren't providing for our teenagers, a fundamentally important part of their development. And we were leaving it to them to create it for themselves, and they were doing that through drugs and alcohol and losing their virginity in the worst way possible, and fights and music festivals and all these sorts of things. And that was sort of a part of my movement into what we're doing. And the other big pivotal moment was that I got married quite young. And at 27, I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, both in nappies, and my wife, who was from overseas, and for whatever reasons, we broke up, and I found myself at home on my own with a 1 and a 3-year-old in nappies. And that was an absolute turning point for me. And for the first time at 27, that's when I consider I grew up. And for the first time, I had to put someone else in front of me and look after their needs. And I couldn't just go off and go for a surf or go for a run or do something. I actually had to genuinely be there for someone else. And so that was a second pivotal moment. And the third pivotal moment was about a year after that, I actually went on a men's gathering and left behind phones, and we weren't allowed to talk about work or money, just about, ourselves and our feelings and our experiences. And that was really life-changing for me. And someone said, look, imagine if we'd had this sort of experience when we were teenagers and had been supported and facilitated. And I started looking into rites of passage, and from there, rites of passage just basically took over my life. And, I guess the rest is history. Now I'm the CEO of the Rites of Passage Institute, and we've got programs happening all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. And at the same time, you and we're all still in transition. It's all still kind of becoming and unbecoming all at the same time. I mean, all the iterations that you've had to go through now during COVID.
Well, I actually believe that life is a series of transformations. Mm-hmm. And I look at it as like it's a staircase, and we're moving up the staircase, and we start as a baby, and then we become a child and a young adult, a grown up, an elder, and in between we may or may not become a parent or a grandparent. We may get married, we may have different sorts of relationships, but each of these and different careers, each of these is a stage in life, and at each stage we are different. To move from one stage to the next, we have to go through a transformation. We have to change our core beliefs and our understanding of the world, and ideally, each of those stages would be marked with a rite of passage. That is actually the aim of a rite of passage, is to psychologically move you from one stage in life to the next. And it's so interesting about how this coronavirus pandemic is in fact a rite of passage, in that it is moving us, it's transforming us. And I'm fascinated by that and how we can manage that in the best way possible.
Yeah. Well, would you say that it is transforming us, or that it's giving us the opportunity to transform? And I mean, some people for this time will be deeply revealing and confronting, and they might recluse a little bit more or even shut down even more. And for some people, they might turn towards that, and then it does become maybe transformative in a sense. But would you say that it is transforming us, or it's...
I believe it is. It will transform. Well, it will transform the world. And so if the world in which we're living is transformed on some level, we have to be transformed. The bigger question for me is, will it transform us in a positive way that we grow from? And we can discuss what that means, a positive way. Or will it become a traumatic event that actually creates a wounding and baggage and, problems and issues that we need to spend the next 10, 20 years working through? And there is choice. There's always choice when we're faced by a challenge in life as to whether we grow from it or whether we let it actually take us over.
Yeah. So I suppose for then thinking back to the idea of integration, and I mean, I had an experience as well when I first went to Boulder, Colorado for the first time, outside Australia by myself, living in the Rocky Mountains with 10 others. And, explored my sexuality and many other things, came back home and felt completely alone in my family system and in my normal friendship group. They, saw me exactly the same as who I was. And it wasn't until my 21st birthday that I had to kind of construct this event where I shared to my community, essentially, who I was. And that was my own kind of self. It was coming out. And it was also me saying that actually I'm changed now. I've been away, 2 years. This is me, like it or not. This is who it is. And so for those now, though, who have been forced to move back home, to live with their parents, and therefore for the parents to be living with their children again. How do you, or how would you recommend or guide maybe parents in creating that space for their children to come home and to share themselves as a new kind of version of themselves? How would you as a parent?
Great question. First of all, thank goodness at your 21st, you had that opportunity to share with your community who you are. Because just imagine how many people don't do that. And therefore, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, internally, and become strangers to their parents and their communities. And because of that, they have to leave. They actually either have to physically leave or they have to emotionally and psychologically check out. And then they're not being authentic. And then you have all the issues that come from that. So thank goodness that you did that. The question that you asked me about children coming to live home and how can the parents manage that well, the first thing I would say is let's just not leave it up to the parents. Let's say how can the children, because many of these children are now adults, and if the children slip back into I'm a child role and it's the responsibility of the parents to organise this to go well, the chances are that it won't. Because they'll slip back into child-parent role, and that's just not going to work well at all. So it really is about how can we all manage this well. And there's a few things I would recommend. So a rite of passage is 3 stages: a separation from our normal lives, going into a container, and then an integration. The separation has happened for many of us, we've left. The container that many are in is the home with the family, and the integration we'll talk about later. So within the container where transformation occurs, there are supposed to be 4 elements. And the first one is the sharing of stories. So one of the greatest things that parents and children can do in this time is share their stories with each other. The parents sharing their stories about their lives and when they were the age of the children, and at all stages, things that have gone well, things that haven't gone well, lost dreams, etc. And for the young, I'm sort of struggling a bit calling them children. Yes, they are technically, but for the young adults who are now living with their parents, to share your stories and talk about what's been going on and progressively become more and more brave about what you share so that everyone in the family actually gets to know each other genuinely. Because if you don't, you just default back to when you were 12 years old at the dinner table. And who wants to, be 20, 30, 35 years old and back as a 12-year-old at the dinner table? So that genuine sharing of stories is hugely valuable. And the other thing that I recommend, it's a check-in. We have check-ins, and there is a formal way of doing a check-in. We call it a golden check-in. But it's basically about sitting down as a family and one at a time, each person sharing while everyone else just listens. And ideally you have a talking object so you can see who's talking, and we don't interrupt, we don't make jokes, we don't ask them questions, we just let them speak and we share. And how am I going overall? What have I been doing? What have I liked that's been happening? What's been difficult or tricky? What's coming up that I'm either excited about or nervous about? And what do I need? And that's golden. There's lots of ways you can do it. But basically, if we can get everyone in the family having a genuine check-in, and then the young adults, the children get to really share where they're at, and as importantly, the parents get to share and the young adults get to hear that, then we start shifting this I'm the parent, you're the child, to we're actually a family that is a community, and we are genuinely sharing where we're at and also our stories so that we are knowing who each other is. That actually takes us a long way down the track of growth and healing and connection. And it's a good starting place for how we are in this container of, home and family.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the idea, and it's quite clear that the home is the container for this transformation.
Yeah.
It's quite simple. Now it's about filling the container with rituals that reconnect, in a sense. And I'm curious about the idea of ritual and how, like, we talk about ritual design and ritual theater, and your perspective on kind of the elements that make a ritual, so that we can facilitate ritual for ourselves as individuals during any transitions, or we can facilitate ritual for groups. And I sometimes find it interesting with my parents when I came back from overseas and I'd moved out straight away because I felt alone with them. I moved out knowing it would be healthier, but then I invited them over for dinner and I bought a pack of question cards, the typical School of Life question cards, and I'd curated which ones I had in the deck so that I knew which ones they might choose. And because I knew the idea of the third object and facilitation, to make it less daunting, have them choose the card, and then it's not me asking the question, the card asked you the question, and we'll go around and we'll share our response. And so we had wine and pizza, and I had mum and dad choose cards, and my brother was there as well. And the first question was something about, under what conditions would you be okay with an open relationship? Or I was just having questions, made sure they were questions that had something to do with my worldview as well, so that I had an opportunity to speak about, actually, yeah, I am exploring open relationship, and actually, yeah, X, Y, and Z. And it worked really well. For me at that time, I wouldn't have been able to ask those questions, and so I kind of had to employ the cards. But what are some of the things that you use and that you've seen work well in kind of ritual theater and ritual design in maybe family scenarios, which are usually really ripe with historic patterns and insecurities? What kind of rituals, other than sharing story, might be useful or that you've seen work?
Okay, great. Good, big question, Al. So the word ritual comes from this idea that it is something that is done over generations in the same way. So a wedding is a ritual that's been done for hundreds and thousands of years, and people wear certain clothes, and there's the holy person of the community comes out and oversees and blesses it, and the community comes around and all of that. So one of the challenges is that a lot of the healthy rituals sort of disappeared. So we are now looking at recreating rituals. And there are a few principles that are important, and one of them is to recognise that it's done in a different time. So there's time, which is what we sort of call profane time, when we're doing our emails or doing the washing or getting ready for dinner, or just those everyday things that take up so much of our time. And then there's something called sacred time, which is special and touches us and gets, opens our hearts. And in sacred time, time itself changes. It either slows down or speeds up. And so one of the things, if we're going to do, is to find a way to create sacred time. So a big part of that is to get the intent of the people who are involved in the ritual on the same page, that we're going to do something special together. If we can remove outside distractions like watches and phones and all of that sort of stuff, so that we can be really present. There's a whole thing around setting the space and allowing people to sort of remove the cloak of profane time and do what they need to do so they can just be present. I always, and you mentioned it, ritual theatre. I like to bring things in that are different from our everyday. So nature, if we can be outside by a fire, like if you can get a fire and sit around a fire, you are 90% of the way to having created a ritual. Yeah. If you can't do a fire, light a candle, or maybe you make some flowers in a nice way, or things like that. And then it's about, really bringing the respect, everyone present, everyone in a similar intention, and saying, okay, well, what are we trying to do here? And let's say we're doing a ritual to create our vision for the future. So if we set it up in a particular way, and then we may or may not choose one person to run the ritual, but creativity is a beautiful part of it. So, if I use it as an example, then it helps us to understand what we're talking about. And if we're doing a ritual for creating vision for the future, we might go and sit outside if it's a nice day, or we might create a space in the house. We might light some candles, whatever. And then as simple as just getting everyone to close their eyes, to settle down, to be present, and to just imagine that they've gone on a journey and they've come back and it's 5 years from now and life's going really well and they've created what they wanted to create and they're with who they want to be with. And, and that can be a 1 minute meditation or a 10-minute, and then to actually get people to share what they saw in that, or to draw it, or to make it out of bits and pieces that are within the house. But somehow trying to get people out of their logical mind into their sort of their right brain. And so that, that is an example of how you could create a ritual around what you want to do for the future. You may want to create a ritual around some things that you need to let go of, some behaviours that that don't work for you. So you might go, okay, well, how are we going to do that? Let's set up sacred space, blah, blah, blah. Get everybody thinking about some things they want to let go of. Get them to write it down or hold a stick and then throw that into a fire, or break it up or tear it into bits and bury it. Something to ritually symbolise, this is something I know I need to let go of, and now I'm going to go through a physical act of doing that. So I guess intention, creativity, enrolment of your group, having it as a sacred space without distractions. If we do those things, then we bring ritual into the energetic of what we're doing.
Yeah, many people do that kind of, whether it's around the full moon, the new moon, there's many different cycles and patterns, but it's, I suppose, nice to know the elements of ritual and that we can do it for ourselves. If we feel we are going through a moment, just the other day, noticing how overwhelmed I felt with how full my calendar was for no reason other than I'd forgotten how to say no. And so take a moment to journal, to reflect on that. It's a ritual in itself. Scrunch up a piece of paper, feel totally different. So it's nice to know that we can create ritual. It's a human creation. It's a creative act.
Absolutely.
Journaling.
Journaling can be the ritual itself, or you might, before you journal, spend 2 minutes just meditating and go for a walk to the edge of the garden and back or something, and create a ritual to really put yourself in the best space to journal. So, ritual can be a very simple thing, and it can also become very complex and, and it's a fabulous, good ritual is what they call sacred space is regenerative. So when we are in sacred space, we get energy from it, and ritual falls in that category of being regenerative. Whereas the profane stuff, the busyness that you're describing, tends to take our energy, whereas ritual gives us energy. Sacred space gives us energy.
Yeah. Curious to dive more into actually a question around community and the role of community in these rituals. So, I mean, for centuries, rites of passage and self-initiatory ceremonies were used, I suppose, to help one come into themselves in the context of community, for them to be recognized by the community. And it's a kind of not just a self-initiation, but it's also a community initiation, and it bolsters the development of the community and the collective itself. I'm curious just to hear a bit more about your perspective on the role of community in these containers and how crucial it is.
I think it's incredibly crucial. So, a lot of what I do in my work with rites of passage is I've tried to understand what happened in traditional communities and why, and then look at what's relevant today and how can we use that in a positive way. And community was a key part of, it was all about community. And in fact, the first rite of passage of a child becoming a young adult was one of the biggest reasons was to change the psyche from the belief system of a child, which is it's all about me, I'm the centre of the universe, to one of I'm actually part of a community. And my fundamental role is to do as much good as I can for the community. And interestingly, one of the ways that I can do as much good as I can for the community is to discover who I am and what are my gifts and what my spirit is, and to bring that out and give it to the community. So it was all about that. And the other thing is, in the traditional communities, they were very much into social structure. So a child was a child, a young adult was a young adult, an elder was an elder, and you move through. And rites of passage were a way of maintaining that social structure and supporting people to sort of move up this staircase. So the community had a great deal of interest in rites of passage, because if you didn't have rites of passage, you would end up with adults who still acted like children, who still thought they were the centre of the universe, and who would destroy the community for their own greedy, self-serving benefit. I mean, imagine that.
Well, I don't think we have to imagine it. We're kind of in it, unfortunately.
No, that's right. That's right. So they they recognised the incredible importance of rites of passage, and it was actually considered regenerative to the community. And when any group in the community would be going off to their rite of passage, the whole community would know about it or be involved in some way. And generally, when they returned, there was a big community celebration. Now, we live in a time where there's basically, what's community now? Is community our group of Facebook friends? Is it the people we're currently living with? Is it the people who we grew up with? And so there are so many different definitions of community. And so one of our challenges is to be creating and building the strongest communities that we can, which may, in fact, many of us belong to multiple communities. But there's no doubt that building and being part of community is a healthy thing, as opposed to being on our own and looking after ourselves rather than being part of something greater than ourselves.
Yeah. And almost more importantly, well, not more importantly, but I know for myself, measuring community, or the communities that I really value, are the communities that also value my development. And it kind of speaks to the fact of, traditionally, these ceremonies were facilitated not only for the development of the individual, but because they understood that the development of the individual kind of protects the integrity of the community. And the community
would say that Al Jeffrey, he has gifts and he has a great spirit, which is actually extremely obvious. And our role within the community, especially us elders, is to make sure that we support Al Jeffrey to find and bring out his gifts, because what is a gift? It's something you give away. So if you can connect with your gifts and your spirit, not only will you as an individual shine, but those gifts and your spirit will benefit the community.
Yeah.
Which very much, I love that, because it speaks to this question, what's more important, the individual or the collective? And when it's done well and properly, they both have each other's interest at heart, which is fabulous. And by the way, I do have to mention, Al, I know you personally are actually very good with community. It is something that is a great priority to you. I know that. I know that you have a large community around you. And, I want to name that, because not everybody is. And it's definitely a gift of yours, is this building of communities.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been, I invest in community because I've felt the lack of community and what that, taken me to suicidal ideation in many dark places. And so I've felt the feeling of isolation and a lack of meaningful community, the lack of being recognized by those around me. So therefore feeling so alone in my identity, which is why I resonate so much with the work of Rites of Passage. So in this time, and I suppose I didn't note in the beginning, but in having these conversations for podcasts during this time, it's hard not to relate any conversation to COVID, because it seems like the only thing that we're worried about. But also like to note that my sense is that this time is really just a really intensification and kind of an amplification of the natural state of our lives, which is change and transition, as we talked about. So this is just kind of an intense training ground for actually how do we start to be agile and adaptable and resilient to life itself. So the notion of the unknown and sitting in the unknown or apprenticing ourselves to the unknown, that liminal space between where something is no longer, but something is not yet as well. And so we're in that space of emptiness. Obviously, in your rites of passage work, you're architecting those moments for people where they are in that liminal, they've reached that threshold. How would you describe, instead of just saying to someone who is in that unknown space and is feeling uncomfortable, because the last thing they want to hear really is just apprentice yourself to it, just lean into it. That's really nice. But how would you, I suppose, invite someone to lean into the unknown? Like, what are some of the ways one might soften into that difficult place?
Okay. Well, am I allowed to be sort of a little bit controversial and go a bit hard here, Al?
Of course. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So there's a few things. So first of all, yes, life is about change, but I don't believe necessarily that change happens, 2 degrees every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we just progressively change. I believe we go along pretty much the same, and then an event happens which changes us. And then we go along and for a period of time, which might be a month, a year, 10 years, and then change happens again. And that event may be puberty. It may be getting married. It may be when one of our parents dies. It may be when we have a child. It may be when we fall in love, lose our virginity, come out, anything. All of those are change moments after which life is not the same. And we need those moments. I also believe that a lot of people have spent their whole life avoiding those moments. And we live in a society where everybody wants to stay young and pretend they're still young and, in how they dress or using plastic surgery or whatever. So at the moment, we have an enormous backlog of people who are desperately needing change that they have put off for way too long and have been living in this sort of, we live in a denial world which is perfectly set up to do everything it can to support us to pretend that nothing's ever going to change. And so the big things happening now is, like it or not, we're being forced to look at things. And there is a problem that everybody wants change and growth to be gentle and supported and, that we agree to it and it works according to our time schedule and in the way that we want it. And, it's not always like that. And sometimes it's not about it's actually becomes about submitting to what's happening. And we've had to submit to what's going on here. And, we go into our space and the first 2 weeks we're in anxiety and stress and, how we're going to cope. And then at a certain point you submit and you go, oh, okay, well, I've just got to stay here now. So I don't decide to go into the unknown. I'm just bloody thrown in there. And at a certain point I accept it. And when we accept and submit, then it changes. And our experience of it can become completely different. And we can sort of dance with it. It becomes sacred. As you said, it's a blessing and a curse. We can start to, I've seen shadow elements of myself in these last months that I'm really embarrassed about and quite shamed about. And I've also seen other aspects of myself that, are really, I'm happy about. So there's that element that comes in. And Robert Moore, who's one of my sort of, mentors, even though he's passed away, he talks about that one of the things about a rite of passage is that it's the equivalent of a psycho-spiritual death and dismemberment, which is a pretty strong statement. But what he's saying is that our psycho-spiritual belief system has to die and get dismembered so that we can move to the next stage. And that's not always pleasant at all. And then he says, and we have to let go of our prized narcissism. What a beautiful statement. We have to let go of our prized narcissism. And when you really go through a rite of passage properly, and it'll never happen to me or you, but one of the best examples of a rite of passage, is a woman giving birth. And, there's a psycho-spiritual death of one stage of life and a letting go of, so many things to move to the next stage. And for many of us as men, it probably doesn't happen until we get old and our bodies start failing and our, things start not working. And it's a psycho-spiritual death and no longer are we what we were, and we have to let go of that. So rites of passage, and when you look at what they did historically, they weren't a pleasant experience. And in fact, very often the people going through the rite of passage would be painted in the community with a death mask. If the death mask in that community was white, there are 2 times you would be painted with that death mask. One is when you died, but the other was when you went through your rites of passage, because they were absolutely saying this is a death and it can be every bit as unpleasant as a death because we want you to be reborn. And so, on some level, something in our lives is dying at the moment. And it might be our careers that we've had. It might be relatives or people we know. Or it might be just belief systems that we've had about ourselves and about certainty, about youth, about that everything's just by definition going to be okay. But there will be, for everyone, some fairly fundamental belief systems that are being seriously challenged at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it is incredibly uncomfortable, but I'm also curious about in sitting with others in that space. So when it comes to leadership, and we both do a fair bit of work around leadership and the art of facilitation in this kind of liminal space, how does one sit opposite somebody who is obviously in discomfort of the unknown? And it seems like they're asking for some sense of security or structure. They're asking for an answer. They're asking you to tell them what's next. But we know that's not what they actually need. They need to sit there for long enough that the answer kind of reveals itself. So an authentic leader in their integrity would have that comfort within themselves to be able to sit with someone and not know together. How might that show up now? What are some of the things that you could say? Just some concrete words even that you might say to people instead of just always blasting out affirmations or a silver lining. What are some things that you might say a participant in a program is coming up against that?
Yeah, well, it is that great question around whether we give people what they want or what they need, and whether we tell people what they need to hear or whether we tell them what they want to hear. And once again, we're very much socialized to give people what they want. And I have certain issues with that, obviously, in my work, because I think we do them a much greater service when we support them with what they need. And we can do it compassionately. So if I'm sitting opposite someone who's really struggling and in the unknown and hugely uncomfortable with that, if I can tap into my empathy, and one of the best ways to do that is just by sharing a story of a similar experience that I've had, and I might talk about, what the story I mentioned before about how at 27 I had 2 children on my own and didn't know whether their mother was ever coming back, and how I was in the greatest, whereas until that time I'd believed you grow up, you get married once, you're in one relationship, you have basically one house, one family, and overnight that entire belief system crumbled. And if I can share that story and how difficult that was for me and then the process that I went through and what happened, then hopefully that person listening can go, oh, okay, so this actually does happen. This is a thing, and the fact that I'm in it doesn't mean there's something wrong with me, and it doesn't necessarily make it easy, but it's like, if I can support that person and have them know that I'm there and I'll listen to them and I'll share my stories and I'll do the best I can for them, but I won't, and I can tell them, I'm not going to tell you what you just want to hear. I'm going to try and be honest with you and support you so that, and this is very important, so that you can come through this in the most positive way possible. Because if someone has an expectation that it's going to turn out a certain way, and if we create that expectation and then it doesn't, that's when we create a genuine wounding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a way of...
story. one of the
story.
most powerful ways of supporting.
Yeah. To, in a sense, I suppose, normalize their experience, to say that I was there too and it sucks, but here I am. So, make of that what you will. But yeah.
And I've been there and I have been there many times.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think of it as kind of an African American mother who's really loving and kind and will say that I feel you and I see you, but has a very hard line and knows how to draw a boundary of that's not my responsibility. I love you and I see this hurts and I also know that you've got this. So I'm not going to baby you and I love you. I just love that as kind of an archetypal energy almost to step into. So as we start to, I suppose, just round up, I want to make sure we touch on integration, and especially in the context of COVID. I know for me, there is a kind of anxiety about when restrictions start to get pulled off and whether we might see some sort of overcorrection in people's behavior and kind of the social shaming that happens, the discomfort now in being close to each other and hearing a sneeze on public transport and getting triggered, or like the overcorrections that might take place. So just really feeling a sense of anxiety for this transition and what we're bringing with us and what we're leaving behind. Yeah, so for you, integration, how and why is it so important, and what might we be thinking about during this time?
Well, I think it's great that you bring that up. And especially, you told a story of your really badly managed integration when you came back from overseas. And I had a similar experience. And integration is actually often the part in modern rites of passage which are most poorly managed, because a rite of passage is supposed to be facilitated. So there would be someone there taking care of it and making sure integration happened. And there's supposed to be a community to hold that space. And we don't have either of those things. We don't have anyone managing this rite of passage and telling us how, about the stages and all the rest. And community is very fractured. So there is, in fact, a great risk that integration will be managed poorly and that we will lose a lot of these incredible lessons that we have created or we have seen. So in terms of integration, I think we first of all need to take responsibility for ourselves, as you've talked about. And I think it's worth actually writing down or somehow marking or noting a list of the things that you've seen, realised, that you're prepared to commit to, so that you can actually capture what is going on for you in this space. And I'm encouraging as many people as possible to do that. And then my intention is to share that with my community. And then when we do come out, the sharing of stories and the finding out from people, and especially while it's fresh, what happened for you? What did you think about? What did you realise? What did you decide that you wanted to change? How are you actually going to do that? A part of a rite of passage is creating a vision for the future, and that future is when you integrate. So if we can find a way of capturing what we want to change, how we want to be, what we want to let go of, and then publicly naming that to the people around us who are important, that gives us a much greater chance of going to that place. And as a leader and as a person in a community, I believe if we can share with other people the idea of doing this process, it's actually a ritual in whatever way they do it, but having that intention that will make a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I see a great opportunity to, even on Zoom, gather together with 8 to 16 friends or something and have a ritual of sharing story and vision and letting go of some aspect of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Lovely. So in closing, how can people find you and your work? I mean, we could have kept chatting and so much I want to talk about in terms of the soft skills of facilitation and space holding and more of the nitty gritty. But we might cap it here. How can people find you, and what might be some leaving remarks?
Great. Well, they can find me through the Rites of Passage Institute, RITES, of passageinstitute.org is our website. We've also got some courses there, courses for parents and children to do at home during this period. We've produced a 7-part e-course, which has been really popular, and it's People do it at their own pace, and it's a really beautiful and amazing and transformational thing to do with your children of any age at home during this period. And we're going to do more and more stuff online, and then hopefully in the next few months get back to doing it in person. And we want to train as many people in the rite of passage framework like you came along, and I just clearly remember you on that training, Al, and it was great having you there, and supporting people so that they can understand the framework of a rite of passage and then take it into their own families and their own communities. And I guess my closing remarks would be that this is a sacred time, and it's not over yet. It's actually got quite a long way to go, and we actually don't even know how far it's got to go. But the more we can really intentionally create ritual within it and share our stories and look at our challenges and create a vision for the future, all of those things, there is an enormous opportunity being presented to us. And my hope is that people really, take that opportunity to the fullest. And thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your wonderful work in the world and for sharing some stories and perspectives here. And for those listening, I do recommend definitely checking out ritesofpassageinstitute.org. It'll all be in the show notes. Yeah, thank you for taking the time. I mean, we have lots of it at the moment, but also it's overwhelming at times. So thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely.
What questions are still whirring inside for you? What landed and rung loudly for you? Let's take a moment. Thank you for joining me for another life-affirming and enriching conversation, each one a light, a torch to guide us on our path to being in right relationship with ourselves, those we walk with, and the ecologies we are very much a part of. I trust this has gifted you something to place in your toolkit to support you in your journey and your leadership. Make sure to connect with me and leave any comments on my Facebook or Instagram page at @ljeffrey, and check out the links in the show notes. This show is completely funded by listeners just like you, so if you feel generous and wish to be part of nourishing these inquiries that we're exploring together, you can leave a once-off donation or soon subscribe to my Patreon membership. Show notes, resources, and donations are all at www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, we can't rush our way back. Notice connections and tend to the sweet, sweet spaces between. Lots of love.